Wait Willis, who had initially contacted me about AJ coming as a part of the DeMott Bible Symposium that you heard Dr. Fedler talk about. He said, would you like to have AJ speak at First Methodist? And I immediately said, unequivocally and resoundingly, yes. How can we make that happen? So thank you, Wait. Really appreciate that. Many of you know that Wait recently retired from Florida Southern College after 39 years? 47, goodness, 47 years as professor of religion there at Florida Southern College. Yeah. And many of his friends and former students gathered this weekend to celebrate him. Of course, Wade and Susan have been integral in the leadership here at First United Methodist Church, who are our worship leaders for the contemporary service that started in 97? 95. See, I'm off on my ears, but I'm so grateful that you're here to correct me. You know, up until just a couple of years ago, they were there every single week faithfully. Of course, Wade's impact on Florida Southern College and this congregation, this community, will live on for many, many, many years. So Wade, we want to congratulate you on your retirement, and congratulations on your much-deserved status as Professor Emeritus at Florida Southern College. So I was honored to be able to affirm that recommendation. Thank you, Alex. Resident theologian of the Florida Annual Conference, and that was just announced on Friday? Yeah. Thank you, Alex. We've heard about the symposium, so thank you, Dr. Fedler, for sharing about that. So now for the reason that we're all here. Dr. A.J. Levine is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. Professor Levine has been awarded grants from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies.
If I weren't qualified, I wouldn't be here.
So, very good. So some of you know her books, and her newest study is on the Gospel of John, and she's written a new book on Jesus for everyone, not just Christians, which I'm looking for. I've got a copy of it this week, and I haven't had a chance to read it, but looking forward to it. She just returned from the Netherlands. She is co-editor of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, and that was recently translated into Dutch. So perhaps you'd like to share a bit about your experience there, particularly given the unrest and violence between Jews and Arabs there in Amsterdam just the week before you arrived. The week that you did arrive. She's also heading from here. She'll be speaking at St. Leo, and then of course here at Florida Southern tomorrow, and then out to the West Coast for the Society of Biblical Literature. So she is a busy person, and we are delighted to have her with us. Her books are available in our Giving Tree bookstore. We were able to get a few copies of them, and of course, if you need any of those or are interested in any titles in particular, let us know. We'll be happy to get those for you. I won't go through her entire CV, as it's about 105 pages, I think, at last count. But there is a link that I sent around that you can certainly check that out if you would like to. So the reason that we're all here, of course, is to hear from Professor A.J. Levine. So please join me in welcoming her.
Okay. Good morning. Nice to see you all. Regarding the Pharisees, so we'll spend a day on them tomorrow. This is just a pitch in case you're thinking, should I come, should I not come? In 2019, there was a conference that was in part sponsored by the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, the Pontifical Gregorian Institute in Rome, and a number of other groups. So an international conference trying to figure out what we know about the Pharisees. So we managed to get an audience with the Pope, which was pretty cool. Now, it turns out, I did not know this, that when you get an audience with the Pope has to give a speech, which then goes up on the Vatican website. But the Pope is busy because being a Pope, that's a hard job. So the people who organize the conference write the talk for the Pope, and then the Pope handlers determine what he will or will not say. So 2 priests and I wrote the Pope's talk on the Pharisees. As my husband described this made me the Holy Ghost writer. And I'm hanging on to that. And he was very gracious, and he talked about how Pharisees have been used as a negative term. Like, you might be a Pharisee if, and then there's all this terrible stuff coming along. If you're a hypocrite, if you're elitist, if you don't like women, whatever. And what we're trying to do is figure out, you might be a Pharisee if, like, you'd invite Jesus to lunch. I mean, that's a good thing. So what we're trying to do is get a better sense of the historical Pharisees. All right, for this morning, there was some discussion about what we should do, whether I should actually give a lecture, or whether we should have more of a question and answer. Gesundheit. Because a number of you have read my books. I'm a Jew who teaches New Testament. I probably know more about Jesus than you do, right? Because that's what I do for a living. That's what I do full time. I do not worship him as Lord and Savior. Why? Because I've never felt the calling. Belief is not a matter of connecting the dots. It's not a matter of intellect. It's not a matter of IQ. Belief is a matter of revelation. Why does one believe in something? Because your heart tells you it's true. So belief is more like love than it's like Sudoku, right? Those little number puzzles. Anybody can do Sudoku. I'm actually very good at it. All it requires is logic and an eraser, and the answer key in the back. And at some point, you can get it. But belief is like love. So if your heart is inclined toward the love of the Christ, terrific. My heart is completely fulfilled within my own Judaism, so I'm just not feeling that call, right? But that doesn't stop me from being fascinated by Jesus. He was really smart, and he was ethically profound, and he provoked. So there's a good sense of provocation. His parables are wonderful stories. They're world literature, and I find that I actually become a better Jew the more I study Jesus. So what we thought in describing or determining what we would do this morning is to figure out what you want to know, what questions you might have about first century Judaism, what questions you might have about both the New Testament and, to use Christian terminology, the Old Testament. That's not a term Jews would use, by the way. Do you talk about Old Testament or do you talk about Hebrew Bible? Old Testament. I think that's helpful because people who talk about Hebrew Bible, I don't know exactly which text we're talking about because the Old Testament is the church's Bible part 1. And in the synagogue, we have the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. It's a different canonical order with different translations, with different reception histories. So as long as people say Old Testament, I know we're talking about Christian Bible part 1. And when some people say to me, well, old is like used up and marginal, and I'm old. Old is fabulous. Old gets you Social Security, still. Old gets you Medicare. Old gets you discounts in the grocery store on Tuesday morning. Old is terrific. So as long as we remember that old is good, the term Old Testament is fabulous. So I'm here. What do you want to know? And I think there have been questions that are already set. So here come the questions, which I have not seen, by the way.
Here, I'll give you a copy of the ones that I have.
You printed them out? Should I? Oh, I've already taken care of Stu's. Hi,
yes.
Stu.
Stu said that, yeah, it was asked and answered, so thank you for that. Bob Hughes, are you here? There you are. Bob, would you like to ask your question? I'll bring you the mic. Here, hang on.
Morning, Bob.
Hello, and welcome.
Thank you.
I recently heard a talk with April DeConnick, and she mentioned that she thought Luke was the last gospel written, even after John. Last Thursday, I had a chance to submit that to Mark Goodacre in an online thing. He said, no, he's got a book on John at the publisher, and he says he thinks John was familiar with Luke. So have you looked into that? Do you have an opinion on whether...
Yeah, so now you're putting me in between April DeConnick and Mark Goodacre, and they're both good friends. And this is sad, but I'm on team Mark here. I think John knows Luke, but they have shared material. So we get Mary and Martha only in Luke and John, for example. Luke tells a parable, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which ends with the line where the rich man who's in hell, he's very uncomfortable. Hell is an uncomfortable place. And he says to Father Abraham up there in heaven, send Lazarus to warn my brothers so that they don't wind up in hell too. And the line is, even if somebody came back from the dead, it wouldn't change their minds. And then You flip over to the Gospel of John chapter 11, and here's the story of a fellow named Lazarus who comes back from the dead. And that actually becomes the prompt that gets Jesus to the cross. It's not the cleansing of the temple, it's the raising of Lazarus. So there are some other connections, minor connections between Luke and John. So which came first? It strikes me as highly likely that John knows Luke and that John is taking some of that Lucan material and more or less fixing it. So if we read just Luke, we would think that Mary and Martha never talk to each other, because they never talk to each other in Luke. In John, they're the best of friends. They talk to each other, they work together. Even at the raising of Lazarus, after Jesus and Mary have their chat, Mary goes to tell Martha, who's still in the house, the Lord is asking for you. Not in the text. It's like, come on, sis, get with the program. I think what John has done is taking the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. John has no parables at all. They're only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But notably, in the Gospel of Luke, or in fact, in all three synoptic Gospels, the only character who's named in a parable happens to be Lazarus. And I think John took that name, and that helped John develop the story of the raising of Lazarus. So I think John knew Luke. Can we prove it? No. Is it possible that the first two chapters of Luke were written after? You can make that argument. The first two chapters of Luke get us the Christmas story. The census went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world be enrolled. We get the birth of John the Baptist to an elderly, infertile couple. And anybody who knows the Old Testament knows that if you have an elderly, infertile couple, within 3 verses, the woman's going to be pregnant, because that's how the convention works. It's very Old Testament-y. It's also very Jewish in the sense of ritual practice. The circumcision of John the Baptist, the circumcision of Jesus, the presentation of Jesus in the temple. And some folks have made the argument that these first 2 chapters were added on later because you don't get that focus on purity concerns. You don't hear a whole lot of women's voices in chapters 3 on, but at the beginning we have Mary's Magnificat with these wonderful hymns. So it's possible that these chapters were added on later to a church which was experiencing a sense of maybe we should just jettison the Old Testament. Maybe we should jettison all that Jewy stuff. Jewy? I'm not sure what the adjective would be. And just start with the genealogy, which may be where Luke starts originally, because you get the genealogy and then you get the story of John the Baptist. That looks more like Matthew. So I would accept the idea that Luke 1 and 2 might be post-John, but I don't think the rest of the gospel. The other question is, whenever you determine this came first and this came last, so what? Right? So how do we read these texts differently? And I'm not sure that makes a huge amount of difference. So it's of interest to scholars. Does it matter theologically? I'm not sure. And the good news here, there's much good news here. The good news is whichever came first or whichever came second, the church decided to put them both in the canon. So they're both of value. We okay with that, Bob? You're welcome. Is that more or less what Goodacre said?
Janet, I'm going to invite you to ask your question. We'll pass the mic down to you so you don't have to.
Thank you. This is to you as a person. I read your bio and I was fascinated. You certainly have met some challenges along the way. What is in your toolbox for dealing with adversity, naysayers, negativity, and some of those people that just like to challenge you?
Well, I don't mind a good challenge. A good challenge is fun, as long as it's something I can talk about. So if somebody wants to challenge me on, say, the Quran, I'm not going to engage, because I can't read Arabic. In graduate school, to get a PhD in New Testament, by the way, I have Duke credentials, so I have my Methodist grounding. You have to learn Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, Latin, and a smattering of French, German, and Italian to be able to read the secondary sources. And then they said to me, it's time to learn Arabic, and I said, no, it's not, because I did not think I could plow another language into my head. Who knew? That was dumb on my part. If I could go back 40 years, I would have learned it. But there's nothing wrong with a good challenge. That's how academics function. And when we sharpen our work by engaging in dialogue with each other. So if April DeConnick, who's an expert on Gnostic texts, among other things, says, maybe you should consider this, my job is not immediately to say, no, my job is to consider, could this be? Those challenges are good challenges. I like that. For people who are negative, and I'm not seeing anybody here because most of you were smiling at me. Can't tell with masks because I'm trusting. It's hard during COVID because you can't read faces. When I give talks and there's like somebody sitting in the front row with a frowny face and arms crossed and looking really angry, I just go over and smile. I smile brightly. You know, thank you, orthodonture when I was 12. So I'm trying to work on people in terms of body language, saying, if you disagree with me, tell me why. When I was very little, my mother told me, and I'm an only child, and my mother was 44 when I was born, so I have some sense of elderly Jewish women trying to get pregnant. She said, everybody is in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, you need to be able to see that divine spark in everybody's face, and I don't care who it is. Hitler, Pol Pot, Osama bin Laden, they too are in the image and likeness of God, and you cannot afford to demonize them. Because once you turn them into demons, then you can't work, there's nothing you can do. They're fellow human beings. When I was little, I had an aunt. And my aunt, who for various reasons, which I learned much later, said horrible things to me. She once said to me, well, you're stupid and you're ugly, but at least you have good posture. I mean, it's like really horrible things. So I said to my mother, I'm not going to say what her name is, but is my aunt also in the image and likeness of God? And my mother kind of looked and sighed and said, yeah, her too. So it's trying to see that spark of humanity, because if I lose that, then I'm going to lose a part of my own self. Sometimes it's self-protective. So if somebody wants to challenge and challenge and challenge and challenge, particularly on a theological question, some of the books I've written were written in part because people had challenged me on certain things. Like, gee, AJ, if you just read your Old Testament closely, you would see that it points to Jesus. So if you don't see that clearly, you're not reading well. So my friend Mark Bretler, who teaches at Duke, another Methodist school, Mark Bretler and I wrote a book called The Bible With and Without Jesus, and we wanted that and in there. So if you read through Christian lenses, you put on like Christological Jesus-centered glasses, you can see Jesus on every page of the Old Testament. But if you take those glasses off and you put on Jewish glasses, you're not going to see him at all. And it's not like Where's Waldo, right, where you look, oh, Isaiah, here's a guy with a scarf and a hat. It's a matter of theological perception. So when people say, gee, if you just read your text carefully, you would see this, I can say, go buy my book. Right, I now get, 60 cents on a royalty, and he leaves me alone. So part of it is, what's the problem? Trying to diagnose it and trying to keep the image and likeness of God there. And that makes a difference in talking about Israel-Gaza. It makes a difference in talking about people who want to disaffiliate from their church for whatever reason. It makes a difference in talking about the most recent election. And rather than demonize and say, how could you possibly have cast your vote for whoever, to say, well, explain to me why you did that. To recognize that there's a logic on both sides and to grant people some intelligence in all of this processing, and not immediately to say that somebody is a bigot or uninformed. Because that's just not helpful. We don't know until we ask. And that stood me pretty well. I also drink a lot of coffee. What else?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I know that several of you have recently done the study on the Gospel of Mark, so if you have any questions related to that, just raise your hand. I think those are all the questions that we had previously submitted. But I wanted to ask, related to the previous question, you mentioned Israel-Gaza. We just passed the first anniversary of the October 7th attacks. We've all seen the news of what's happening in Gaza. You were recently in the Netherlands, where there was violence, and so this is perhaps just a general question. I'll let you take it in whatever direction you would like. I guess broadly, how can we as people of faith respond to what we see happening in terms of what's happening in Israel and Palestine and the associated violence that we see
now around the world.
Yeah. So the solution to all of this is well above my pay grade. I have friends who are in the Israeli army. One of the children my daughter went to school with all the way through high school is a sniper in the Israeli army, and I talk to his mother fairly frequently. I also have friends living in the West Bank, Palestinians, Christians. So how to address these particular concerns? I can do this best, I think, by telling a story, true story. Last November, just about a year ago this time, a local imam in Nashville called me, and he said, I need you to come and do a program at Belmont University on Israel-Gaza. So this is a year ago. And just talking about this from a religious perspective, that I would speak from the perspective of Jewish history as well as New Testament material. And he would speak, he's Egyptian born, he would speak from the perspective of Islam. I said, call a rabbi. But all the rabbis were in Washington, D.C. for a march for solidarity with Israel. And I said, I'm not even supposed to be here. I was supposed to be in Germany, but American Airlines, as they say, bless their heart, canceled my flight to Munich. I got as far as Charlotte and then went back home, and I'm thinking, I have a whole week to myself. He tells me, it's the will of Allah that I'm in Nashville. Now what am I going to do? So I said, okay, I will do this. And on the drive over, I said, and he said, by the way, there will probably be no Jews there, but there will be probably 500 Muslims. Okay. I said, what advice do you have? And he gave me the best advice ever. He said, let them know you feel their pain. And that was so important. When I was talking, and most of them were students, so like I'm always talking to people before a program. It turns out that some of them had seen me on tapes, like, you're really good. Fine, okay, now they like me. And I said, I'm not happy with anybody dying. It's not an issue of numbers. One dead kid is too many. So we're not going to play the numbers game. We're not going to play the but game, like who started it, but this would not have happened if that had not happened. You go back to the time of Abraham. That doesn't get us anywhere either. But to feel each other's pain and then to listen to each other's stories. And I think that's really important. What my Muslim friends did not realize is the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. They looked at us as a bunch of settler colonialists who had absolutely no connection to the land of Israel and said things like, well, there were no Jews there until 1948. Well, no, I mean, I've had family there since the mid-1800s, as far as we can trace them back. The Sephardic Jews from Yemen, from Spain, have been there all along. They were there from before the time of Jesus to after the time of Jesus, continuous habitation of Jews. They had no idea. They had no idea that one could be a Zionist and still be in favor of a Palestinian state. And the question is then, how do you define Zionism? Today, Zionism has become like a slur word. I'm a Zionist, which means I believe that Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people. I also believe that Palestine is the national homeland of the Palestinian people. Now let's have a conversation. And whether it's a two-state resolution or a one-state resolution, to try to hear, again, each other's stories. I also want to hold everybody responsible to the same moral ground. So if the call is stop the bombing, which I think would be helpful, because they're not going to root out Hamas. That's not going to happen. If the call is stop the bombing, then the call should also be free the hostages. If the call is grant Palestinians a state, the call should also be let Israel's neighbors, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, stop throwing rockets into the land of Israel. So that everybody needs to be held responsible to keeping these peace treaties. How do we do that? Listen to each other's stories. And try generally to be fully informed. So in the morning, this is also why I drink coffee a lot. I read Haaretz, which is the English language Israeli newspaper. I read the Jerusalem Post. I read the English language posting from Al Jazeera, and I read the bulletin from the Council of American Islamic Relations, CAIR. Because I need to hear the other stories, and I don't fully trust the media. I hope that answers the question. We're all in the image and likeness of God. Can I come over here because there's a question? Please. Shout.
I will shout. When I was in seminary many years ago, I took a New Testament class on the Gospel of Matthew, and my teacher was a PhD student whose thesis was that Jesus was actually a Pharisee.
Yeah.
Would you speak to that?
Yeah.
AJ, could I ask you just to repeat that for those that may be joining us online?
Right. So the question was, is it possible that Jesus was a Pharisee? And there were a number of people who were making that claim, and it's still made on occasion, because there are certain things that Jesus and Pharisees share in common. They're out among the people. They believe in resurrection of the dead. They have their own interpretation of Torah, because Torah it's a legal document, and all laws need to be reinterpreted. We can see that today with debates over what the Second Amendment means, right? Does the right to keep and bear arms mean you can have a machine gun, right, and use it? So in that sense, they have much in common. The problem is they're also spending a lot of their time arguing with each other. Now, Pharisees argue with Pharisees. The idea of a Jew arguing with another Jew is nothing new, okay? But there's nothing in the New Testament to suggest at all that Jesus was a Pharisee. And when you start getting in the Gospel of Matthew, which is where this question originates, in Matthew 23, you have the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you do all sorts of terrible things. That doesn't sound like insider language to me. That sounds like outsider language to me. So I don't think that Jesus is a Pharisee, but I think he has stuff in common with Pharisees. He has also stuff in common with Sadducees. I mean, the Sadducees are very, very conservative about the law. They didn't like this whole divorce thing. From the beginning it was not so. This is what the Bible says. That no divorce thing is closer to Sadduceeism. Sadducees are more interested in priestly concerns, and Jesus has some priestly interests. He's got stuff in common with the Essenes, like finding a new community not based on the womb you came out of, but on this group with which you want to affiliate. This is called in anthropology fictive kinship groups, which is just a fancy way of saying something like sororities and fraternities. So if you join a sorority, you have your sorority sisters. They are your family. Ideally, that family will continue, until your 50th reunion or your 70th reunion. Well, that's very Essene-like. Who are my mother and brothers and sisters? Those who hear the will of God and do it. Part of the problem here is that we want to put Jesus in a box. And I don't like putting people in boxes. We biblical scholars, we talk about Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Does that sound familiar? Right, and then there's Jews all the way down. Why? Because the Jewish historian Josephus, a first century historian, contemporary of Jesus, slightly younger contemporary, in his Antiquities of the Jews, this very long volume, multi-volume work, talks about Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Why? Because he's writing Roman history, or in the model of Greek history, like Herodotus or Thucydides. And when you write a history of a people, because you're kind of elite, right, you talk about the major philosophic groups, because that's what Romans expected. So Josephus compares the Pharisees with the Stoics. He compares the Essenes with the Pythagoreans. They're kind of like mystical mathematicians, right? He compares the Sadducees with the Epicureans, upper class, loving luxury. And the Zealots are kind of like Pharisees with knives. They're like Stoics who think that, as long as you know what's important, you can literally take out the people who disagree with you. Most Jews don't fit into any of these categories. It would be like saying today, everybody in this room is either a moose, an elk, a Knight of Columbus, or a Mason. Now, I'm betting that there are people here who don't fall into any of those categories. Seems likely. Knights of Columbus, highly unlikely, right? Because it's a Catholic organization. That's what it is to group Jesus into these things. Why does he debate so much with the Pharisees? Pharisees are the precursors of rabbinic Judaism. So when the temple in 70 is destroyed, the priests lose their power base. The community at Qumran is wiped out thanks to the Roman legion that came through in the year 68. The Zealots are pretty much done because they lost the war. And Pharisees, who were lay leaders, are out there more or less to pick up the pieces. So if you're a Jewish follower of Jesus, who's your major competition? The Pharisees. So I think it's likely that some of the invective in Matthew comes not directly from Jesus, but Matthew the evangelist adding to it And that seems likely, because what any good preacher does, and the gospel writers are good preachers, they're not walking around with like shorthand books. They're telling the memories of Jesus that they had to form new congregations and help those congregations live, particularly since Jesus didn't come back, right? How do we live? So they take what they have and they add to it. Just as good pastors, good priests will get up in the pulpit and say, here's a biblical passage. Now let's talk about it. And in that talking, they will add certain thoughts to that passage. And I think that's what the gospel writers are doing. The other reason, it's a problem if you ask an academic a question. We're very bad at sound bites. So there's a person who was interested in psychoanalysis named Sigmund Freud. Okay. About whom my husband has actually written a book. So I know something about Freud because I live with like Mr. Freud scholar. And Freud talked about something he called the narcissism of minor differences. In other words, the closer you are, the more you're going to fight. Siblings will fight more than cousins. People from the same denomination will fight more than people on the other side. This congregation may have more to argue with global Methodists than they will with Buddhists. So the closer you are, the more you want to define yourself over against another group. And that may also be what's going on with the Jesus Pharisees thing. You have to define yourself differently. When you took this course on Matthew and Jesus was a Pharisee, did you buy the argument? Good for you. Good. Wrestling is always good. That's what Israel traditionally means. To be Israel means to wrestle with God. And if the church wants to consider itself grafted onto the root of Israel or somehow grafted onto the system or being part of the family of Abraham, part of that is to wrestle with the text, which I think is really important. So if the text says something that we're not happy about, then instead of saying, well, it's in the Bible, God said it, no, wrestle with it. Jesus wrestles with divine will. Let this cup pass from me. He's not thrilled with the idea of going to the cross. Job wrestles. Job's only patient for 2 chapters. Chapter 3, he opens his mouth, and he doesn't shut up for another 30 chapters. Moses wrestles with God. Elijah wrestles with God. That's what lament psalms do, is wrestle with God. Why have you forsaken me? Wrestle with the text. And in that wrestling, you actually become sharper. And that may be in part Jesus wrestling with the Pharisees. Well, why do you believe this? What's your argument? What's your basis? How does this pan out? That's what Jews do, is we wrestle with each other. And what could be more important than wrestling over what we think God wants us to do? Please. There's Mike behind you.
John here.
You know so much more about my religion than I do about yours, but at the end of Revelation, Christians have an image of the city of God coming down and making things right on earth, the source of Christian hope. Could you tell me a little bit about the source of Jewish hope?
Oh, thanks. So the question deals with hope and that what scholars would call the eschatological moment, the end of time. Sometimes Christians will use the expression kingdom of God, or in Matthew, kingdom of heaven. Jews typically do not talk about a place. We typically talk about a time. So this is just a different linguistic formulation. So we talk about the olam haba. Olam means world, and haba means the coming one. So we have the olam hazeh, the this world, and we have the olam haba, the coming world. Not dissimilar to saying your kingdom come, like that future something. So when Jews talk about the Messianic age, and we get this already from texts in the Old Testament, like Isaiah talking about this glorious mountain, banquet on the mountain of God with wine. If you're Methodist, it can be grape juice, it's fine. And meat with marrow, and nations flocking to Israel to say, show us your God, we have heard God is with you. So it's an international, Jew and Gentile combined giant banquet. Why does Jesus meet people at table, right? It's table, not an altar, it's a table, because that's a foretaste of the Messianic banquet. That gets us the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is put in a manger. A manger is a feeding trough. Where else do you put the bread of the world? You put him in a feeding trough. It's a delicious pun, and most people miss it. So what does that Messianic age look like? Traditionally, now if you ask different Jews, they'll have different opinions. But traditionally, the Messianic age consists of everybody coming back from the dead. So there's a general, everybody comes back. Not a one-off, but everybody comes back. There is an ingathering of the exiles. So the Jews who have been dispersed to the diaspora, places outside the land of Israel, including the 10 lost tribes, interestingly, they come back too. There's a final judgment because there has to be some sort of justice in the world. And then there's a giant ongoing banquet with God. One rabbinic image, there are multiple rabbinic images. This is my favorite one. What is heaven like? It's like a giant seminar room and you get to argue with God at the table and God plays fair. That to me is heaven. It's a giant seminar with people who know more than I do, but I still get to argue. So in that sense, it's actually very much like the book of Revelation at the end. It's the people of God gathering together in a place of peace and security. The book of Revelation, the image of this heavenly Jerusalem descending, there's no temple. You don't need a temple. You don't need to offer sacrifices. Why? Because God is right there and you can thank God. You don't have to worry about sin anymore because sin is no longer there. John, in writing in the book of Revelation, talks about all the sinners. They're the outside of the city. They're still there. Jews, we get our sinners taken care of. We have a sort of odd view of purgatory. But the mercy of God is considered to be generally all-encompassing. So here's what happens. In the early centuries, like the 2nd century after Jesus, the 3rd century after Jesus, as the church is talking more and more about heaven and hell, like who gets in and who's out, the synagogue basically said, okay, you guys can talk about that. We're going to talk more about sanctification in this world, and we're going to leave the whole heaven and hell thing to the predominantly Gentile church. So in the 1st century, Jews had a fairly robust view of heaven and hell, and you can see that in the words of Jesus, who has a fairly robust view about heaven and hell. By the time the 4th century rolls around, that sort of got lost in the divorce between church and synagogue. So the church talked more about salvation and damnation, and the synagogue talked more about sanctification in this world. There's the hope. I can give you a story about this. So it's a true story, and some of you may have heard this. I think I wrote it in one of my books. The year that I was I taught at Swarthmore College, which is outside, a good liberal arts school outside of Philadelphia, for 9 years before Vanderbilt bought me. Academics are kind of like free agents, right? You can be bought. They got me because they offered my husband a job. Fine. So the year that Vanderbilt is recruiting me, my mother, who I had, of course, expected to move into my house in Philadelphia, and who refused, right? She's Massachusetts, and she said, this is the house where I was, my husband lived, my dad died many, many years earlier. This is the house where I raised you, I'm gonna die here. Well, okay. So I get a call from my cousin saying, we think your mom has had a stroke, you need to come up to Massachusetts to be with your mom. My mother was 80 years old, she smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. That she made it to 80 is pretty impressive. And we were actually very, very close. So my husband and I fly up to Massachusetts. We get to Providence, Rhode Island, to the airport. We rent a car, and we go to my hometown, New Bedford, Massachusetts. So if you've ever read, like, Moby Dick, that's my hometown. My mother was in St. Luke's Hospital. This is the hospital where I was born. Do you know about candy stripers? Okay, so I was a candy striper when I was in high school, so I knew my way around the hospital. Right? So we get to intake, husband and I. It's about 10 o'clock in the evening. And I say, I'm Ann Levine's daughter. She's in intensive care. I would like to see my mother. The intake nurse says, it's after hours. I said, I realize that, but I'm Dr. Levine. This is my husband, Dr. Geller. We're from Philadelphia. I really want to see my mother. I did not think it was necessary to say that we were PhDs in religion. We were just Dr. Levine and Dr. Geller. And she said, well, I suppose she actually did check our IDs and asked what my home address was. I mean, she did what she was supposed to do, and she's very kind. And she said, well, we can have somebody escort you up there just for a minute. You can just say hello, but then you need to leave because this really is quite irregular. I said, it's okay. I used to work in this hospital. I know my way. So I get up to see my mom. And my mom was clearly going to die. There was no question about it. She had a DNR, a do not resuscitate. She did not want to be kept alive by any external means. So she's on a morphine drip. Some of you who are doctors may know about this, and you have to regulate it very, very carefully. So she's asleep most of the time. So we get her out of intensive care, and she's in one of those semi-private rooms with the shower curtain in between, right? One chair, right? So I'm sitting on the bed next to my mother, my husband's sitting in the chair, and then we would trade places every once in a while. We got there on Tuesday. Saturday night, about 8 o'clock in the evening, I'm sitting on the bed next to my mother, reading the Vanderbilt handbook. Husband's in the chair reading Freud. My mother looks at me and she says, "What's going to happen to me when I die?" And I said to her, "When you die, you will see Daddy." And my mother looks at me and she says, "But I look like hell." And I said, "Okay, Mom, you're 80 years old, your teeth are in a jar by the bed. Okay, you don't look your best. But when you see Daddy, you will look as beautiful as you looked on the day you got married," because I've seen the pictures. My mother looks at me, totally lucid, and says, "How do you know that?" And I responded, "Mummy, I have a PhD in religion. I know these things." And my mother closed her eyes, and I mean, even recounting the story, I still lose it. I lose it. And I motioned to my husband to come sit next to my mother. I go sit in the chair. My husband's sitting next to my mother, holding her hand. And he's just staring at me, and I'm staring at him. And I cannot tell you how much time passed. But eventually, those machines do what they do, and it's clear my mother had passed. So we're waiting for the hospital personnel to come in and do what they do under such circumstances. And my husband looks at me and says, "I've never heard you say anything like that. I'm not even sure you believe in God." I'm religious but not spiritual. I love going to synagogue. I'm not sure prayers land anywhere. I just like saying them because I find it spiritually uplifting. I'm not even sure where did that come from? But I can honestly say to this day, and this is 30 years ago, when I was talking to my mother, I wasn't saying this to make her feel better. I wasn't saying it because I thought it was the right thing to say at the time. I was saying it because it was true. Absolutely true. And I have no idea where that came from. So what's the Jewish hope? That one's mine. It's the best I can do. I got to Swarthmore in 1985 and I left in 1994. Why? '57 to '61. I'm old, but I'm not that old. Thank you. Please.
Dr. Levine, part of your ongoing academic project is to regain the Jewishness of Jesus. Can you maybe just tell us maybe one story or two stories in the Bible that a failure to understand Jesus in his Jewish context really prevents us from understanding the story?
Oh, how much time do we have? My goodness. Well, if we get thank you for the question. If we get the context wrong, we're going to get Jesus wrong. And if we get Jesus wrong, things typically go sideways in a very nasty manner. So a number of Christians think that, and this is in part because of that invective against the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23, that Jewish law is impossible to follow, as Peter puts it in the book of Acts, a burden that neither we nor our fathers could bear, which is kind of silly because Peter had been living a fully Jewish life, and in following Jesus, he still lives a fully Jewish life. So as long as we understand that Torah was something that was designed to be debated, that the Pharisees were actually known for being the liberalizers. The Dead Sea Scrolls call them the seekers after smooth things. They just make things too easy. Right? When Jesus talks about Torah, he doesn't make it Torah light, he makes it Torah heavy. He's the rigorous one. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, which is a pretty good go-to text for Jesus material, I think, Jesus says, "You have heard it said, 'Do not murder.'" And then most translations read, "But I say to you," and that "but" suggests an antithesis. You have heard this, but I say that, and these become mutually exclusive. And these "you have heard it said, but I say to you" are typically called antitheses. Has anybody heard the term antitheses? So this comes from Hegel. I'm just now showing off, but anyway. So an antithesis is an opposite. An antithesis would be, "You have heard it said, 'Do not murder,' but I say to you, lock and load and take out as many as you can." That's an antithesis. And that's a problem of translation. The New Testament is written in Greek. The word translated but is the Greek word de, delta epsilon de. It's the same word used in the genealogy. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac was the father of Jacob. It's not Abraham was the father of Isaac, but Isaac was the father of Jacob. It just means and. So what Jesus is not doing something antithetical. He's doing something extending. You have heard it said, do not murder. I say to you, don't be angry. That's a very Jewish way of reading the text. Rabbinic Judaism, post-biblical Judaism, talks about, I'm in a book here called Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of the Fathers, talks about building a fence about the Torah, building a fence about the law. What do? We have a law. We make another law to make sure we don't violate the first one. Okay? How does that work in modern terms? In Nashville, where I live, Nashville has lots of like little neighborhoods, and there's a neighborhood called Belmead. And when you drive from Vanderbilt to where I live on the other side of Belmead, the speed limit suddenly drops to 40. Nobody drives 40 miles an hour. Right, it's all 45. This is how Belmead City, I think, makes its budget. So when I'm driving through, I put my cruise control on 38. I've now got a 2 mile an hour buffer so the Belmead police do not get me. What I have done is built a fence about the law. Jesus, don't be angry, because if you're not angry with someone, you're less likely to murder them. Right? You have heard it said, do not commit adultery, and I say to you, don't think about it. Because if you don't think about it, you don't plan it, and if you don't plan it, you're less likely to do it. Very, very practical. So Jesus is respecting the Torah and dealing with the Torah. So what do Christians not get? When we get to Paul is talking to Gentiles. Gentiles means not Jew, not Samaritan. Everybody with me so far? You might think pagan. Okay. And Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. That's what he tells us in Romans. He's like, I am the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul has to explain to these Gentiles that the Old Testament, which was not yet called that, it's just the scriptures of Israel in the Greek translation, is sacred scripture, and that they are welcomed into the family of Abraham and into the family of God via the death of Jesus. Everybody with me so far? But they are not to convert to Judaism, which means they're not under Torah. The men don't have to get circumcised, which I would have thought was good news, but the Galatians are like, it shows loyalty, commitment. Don't follow the Torah. Because if the Gentiles followed Torah, then they would be converting to Judaism. And this goes to the hope question. If they convert to Judaism, then in the Messianic age, the only people who would be worshiping God would be Jews. But the Messianic age, as Isaiah tells us, as Zechariah tells us, is the time when everybody comes to worship the God of Israel, Jews and Gentiles alike. The end of Revelation, where you have many tongues and nations, it's all multicultural. That's a very Jewish view. So when Paul, particularly in the epistle to the Galatians, says to the Gentiles, don't follow the law, it can't save you, he's absolutely right, because it wasn't written for them. And what happens in Christianity is Christians from the 2nd century on begin to forget their Jewish roots. They presume that Paul is writing for everyone and not just writing to a group of Gentiles. And then Torah becomes a very, very negative thing. And then thanks to Martin Luther, the Protestant church increasingly looks at Torah as a negative thing. Does that sort of answer your question? That's fine. I have a question on here that I want to get to, because I think it's a really important question. Could you help us understand the words Jesus speaks to the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman in Matthew 15, Mark 7? It seems that Jesus is being exclusivist when she comes asking for a healing for her child. And he responds by saying, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then he seems to call her a dog. It kind of reminds me of that scene in When Harry Met Sally. And Meg Ryan asks, is one of us supposed to be a dog in this scenario? To which Billy Crystal replies, yes, you are. The only scene in When Harry Met Sally that I remember is the lunch scene. I'll have what she's having. So in Matthew chapter 15, Jesus does say, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That's Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. Earlier on in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 5b, 6, I really am good. Jesus, in giving missionary instructions to the disciples, says, don't go to the Samaritans, don't go to the Gentiles, just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Because Matthew has set up a two-stage mission, as Paul would put it, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And that's pretty much the way it happened. It started as a Jewish movement and then moved to the Gentiles. But then the woman, because of her faith in the Gospel of Matthew, because of her word in the Gospel of Mark, receives the exorcism that she wants from her daughter. So what's going on here? The story is the same story, but Matthew replays Mark, I think, and this goes back to the source criticism question, that Mark wrote first and then Matthew was editing Mark. That's fairly common views. Even Mark Goodacre would agree with that. That's fine. There was a question about where Gentiles fit into the Jesus mission, and Gentiles worried about this. In the Gospel of Mark, I think Jesus doesn't want to deal with this lady because he's having downtime. He's in a house in Tyre. It may well have been Tyre's in Lebanon, so Upper Galilee. It's probably a home of a Jew, by the way, because there were Jews living in Tyre and Jews living in Sidon. And he doesn't want anybody to know that he's there. He just had a big to-do with the Pharisees earlier on in Mark chapter 7. He's tired. And this woman barges in and says, help me, my daughter is severely possessed by a demon. He's like, oh, lady, I really don't want to do this. And she pesters him, and he responds, let the children first be fed, because it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. In other words, it's not your time yet. Let me take care of my own first, and then I'll get to you. She responds, the word is puppies here, even the puppies under the table eat the crumbs that fall from the children. And Jesus responds, because of your word, not because of your faith, but because of what you said, let it be done for you. And then she goes home and she finds the daughter healed. Matthew changes it a little bit. They're not in a house, they're outside, they're on the border. She comes out to him screaming, help me, my daughter is severely possessed by a demon. Jesus doesn't say a word, just ignores her. She keeps going, please help me, Lord, help me. The disciples say, the Greek is loose her. Now, if you're Catholic, it's intercessory prayer, and they're saying, please, Jesus, do this for her. If you're Protestant, we don't like intercessory prayer. It's say, go away. I'm a Jew. I don't have a horse in this race. But you can read it either way. She gets down on her knees in front of him, which is actually a power position. Because it's humble and all that, but if you're kneeling in front of somebody, you're blocking their way. You're basically saying, pay attention to me. So it's both humility and a position of strength. Like, I'm here, pay attention to me. Lord, help me. And then he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? Please help me. She says, help me. And he says, and this is the change from Mark, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Nothing about first. Right. Has he insulted her in both cases? Yes. To call somebody a dog is an insult. It's not a Gentile insult. It's a generic insult. If somebody today calls a person a bitch, that has nothing to do with ethnicity or class. It's got a lot to do with sexism. It's an insult. Right? And to say, well, he just called her a puppy. To call somebody a little bitch is not much better than to call a person a bitch. A puppy doesn't really help. She says, even the children, even the dogs, the puppies, eat the crumbs that fall from their masters. In other words, I know you're superior. I know. And Jesus says, because of your faith, let this be done for you. In Matthew, the little girl was probably standing right there the entire time. So what's going on here? There is a literary convention that we find in both Jewish and pagan sources that's sometimes called the Convention of the Meek, M-E-E-K, king. And the idea is somebody who's got all the authority, all the power, has shown up, and there's somebody who doesn't have authority and doesn't have power, who needs something. And then how do you talk to the person up here? And this is the convention. And the idea is that the person down here begs for something. The person up here says, I don't have time, you're not at my table, go away. And the person down here says something to catch the attention of this person up here. Usually, it's always a him, usually to shame him. And then the person up here says, okay, because of what you said, fine. I'll just give you two examples. The story about the Emperor Caesar Augustus. And Augustus, being emperor, he's busy, he's on a horse, and he's trolling through some town, and this old broken down soldier, veteran, right, comes up to him and says, Caesar, Caesar, I need your help in a court case. This would be like my going to the president and saying, I got a traffic ticket, can you help? Right? And Caesar says, well, fine, because he's a decent guy, I'll send a representative. And the old soldier bares his arm and shows his scars and said, I didn't send a representative to Actium. In other words, when you're battling Antony and Cleopatra, I put my life on the line for you, Buster. And Caesar says, you're absolutely right. And his biographer, Macrobius, says this shows what sort of a man Caesar was. There's another story about Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian. In the eastern provinces, an old woman comes up to him and says, Emperor, Emperor, I need your help. He says, I'm the emperor. And she responds, well, stop being the emperor. And he gets down off his high horse. So what is this? I think it's a lesson to both the disciples, particularly in Matthew, because the disciples are there. It's not clear they're there in Mark. And to people who need something. If you need something, you persist. And Jesus has told other stories about persisting women, like the story of the persistent widow in the parable in Luke chapter 18. You persist. You come to the tomb and you think he's been raised. You persist. You continue to tell people in Matthew. And if somebody insults you, you absorb the insult. You can call me a bitch, fine, I'm a bitch, but even bitches are entitled. Because she had two other options. She could have said, you want to call me a bitch? Well, F you. And that just ratchets up the violence. Or she could have said, you call me a dog, fine, I'll tuck my tail between my legs and I'll leave. But that doesn't get you the healing. So you stay engaged, you absorb the insult, and you persist. So that's good advice for people who need something. That is, by the way, the Sermon on the Mount. If somebody strikes you on the right cheek as an insult, fine, hit me again. I'm not going to cower, I'm not going to lose my dignity, and I refuse to respond with violence. It's exactly what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's a lesson to the disciples. If they're not part of your congregation, they're still children of God, and you pay attention to them. If you have something, you provide for them, like this church does when you provide for people who are not members of your congregation. That is your responsibility, and that's also part, even if you don't want to do it, you do it because it's the right thing to do. So if we recognize the convention of the meek king, we can see how Jesus is setting this up as a model for the disciples. You may not want to do it, but you must. And particularly as a model for people who need something. You persist, you maintain your dignity, you do not respond with violence. And I think that's what's going on in that story. It's a brilliant story. Yep.
Thank you. I'm a real estate broker in Lakeland, and I have two questions tonight for you. One on real estate and one on circumcision. I asked James, he said, do the real estate.
Well, we can do both, and if the thing on circumcision gets too long, we can just cut it off.
Picture this for a minute. A big country is formed, big enough to be a country. It has all the accoutrements of a country. It has land, it's arable, it's got all the things that make you able to function. Now, with that in mind, to what degree is the ongoing Middle East situation simply a matter of who drew the lines for this real estate?
Yeah, thanks. So the question regards who drew the line for the real estate in the Middle East. And there are actually several lines, including the famous Green Line. So there was the line of petition in 1948 that was drawn by the United Nations. There was the line that was drawn in 1967 following the Six-Day War, when Israel comes into possession of the Golan Heights and the Gaza Strip and so on, and East Jerusalem. The first time that Jews were actually allowed to go to the Western Wall and pray there. They were prevented from doing so before 1967 because of the people who controlled East Jerusalem. So there have been a number of borders. Who controls the lines today? It's a problem because not everybody who is invested are interested. There are people in Mr. Netanyahu's cabinet who talk about greater Israel and absorbing what they would call Judea and Samaria. We've heard similar things from Mr. Trump's new ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, speaking from a Christian Zionist perspective. And there are people in the broader Arab world who are thinking that there should be no state of Israel, the entire thing should be Palestine. So who's going to draw the line? Complicating this are the rise of Israeli settlements following 1967, including some settlements that have close to 1 million people now on land that prior to 67 was Palestinian land. So if the borders are going to be drawn, it looks like they're going to have to be drawn with some sort of land swapped. And then we have to worry about things like who gets the water rights, because water is a huge concern. Whose electrical grid is one set up to? If the borders are set up with honest power brokers who are willing to have the courage to do this, like Anwar Sadat in Egypt had the courage to do this, or Yitzhak Rabin in Israel,